joined, and then eventually Ringo joined. So that would be like, I think the Beatles was...
Paul McCartney didn't simply wake up one day as a musical genius. His extraordinary talent was shaped and molded by the artists who came before him. Long before the screaming fans and sold-out stadiums, before the Beatles became a global phenomenon, there was a young boy in Liverpool with his ear pressed against a radio, absorbing everything he could. McCartney understood something fundamental. You cannot create something truly great without first understanding the foundations that others have laid. He consumed music with an almost scholarly dedication, letting it reshape his understanding of what was possible. McCartney never claimed to have invented rock and roll. Instead, he absorbed the music that came before him, honored those pioneers, and then pushed the art form into new and unexpected territories. This approach required both humility and an insatiable hunger to learn. While many legends eventually forget their roots, McCartney never did. Behind every memorable melody he composed, every intricate bass line he crafted, and every soaring harmony he created, there were teachers. These teachers didn't stand in classrooms. They existed on vinyl records, in the grooves of albums, in voices that demanded to be heard. One album in particular served as his foundation, the blueprints he would return to whenever he needed to remember where the magic truly originated. The first album that transformed McCartney's understanding of music was Little Richard's debut release from 1957, titled Here's Little Richard. What struck the young McCartney first wasn't actually the music itself, it was the scream. When he heard Little Richard for the first time, something fundamental shifted inside him. This wasn't polite music designed for Sunday afternoon tea. This wasn't safe entertainment for the whole family. This was a man essentially tearing his voice apart and somehow making it sound like pure, unrestrained freedom. Little Richard arrived in Britain like a lightning bolt wrapped in sequins and glitter. McCartney would later recall that Little Richard's was the first wild, high voice he had ever heard. He recognized that it all came from gospel music, that spiritual tradition transformed into something entirely new. McCartney, barely even a teenager at the time, felt the shock of this music reverberate through his entire body. Songs like Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally, and Rip It Up didn't politely request your attention. They kicked down the door and set the entire room ablaze with their energy. Little Richard didn't simply sing his songs, he exploded through them. Every note was a challenge, a dare to the listener. Every whoop and holler was essentially a defiant gesture against everything boring and proper in the world. When McCartney heard this raw power, he had a revelation. You could actually do this. You could be wild and unrestrained. You could let go completely. This realization changed everything for him. Before Little Richard, rock and roll was still tentatively finding its courage and identity. After him, there seemed to be no rules left to break. McCartney later said that Little Richard taught him that your voice could be a weapon, and this was absolutely true. Little Richard didn't simply perform his music, he attacked the microphone with it. He transformed noise into art and chaos into something approaching gospel. This album represented more than just music to the young McCartney. It was permission to be loud and fearless, to stop apologizing for your ambitions and start screaming them to the world. McCartney never forgot this crucial lesson, and you can hear it echoed in every raw, powerful vocal he would later record throughout his career. The second foundational album was Chuck Berry's After School Session from 1957. Chuck Berry accomplished something that nobody else had managed to do at that point. He made rock and roll intelligent. Before Berry came along, most rock songs focused primarily on feeling and emotion. Berry made his songs about storytelling. After School Session wasn't just another album, it was essentially a masterclass in how 3 simple chords could carry an entire novel's worth of narrative. McCartney listened carefully and realized that rock music didn't have to be simplistic. It could be clever and sophisticated. It could paint vivid pictures in the listener's mind. It could make you think deeply while simultaneously making you want to dance. Songs like School Day, Too Much Monkey Business, and Brown-Eyed Handsome Man weren't just catchy tunes, they were detailed snapshots of American life. Barry wrote about cars, girls, and teenage frustration with the precision and care of a genuine poet. His guitar playing spoke in complete sentences. His lyrics moved with the fluidity of film. McCartney studied every single line, every riff, every story that Barry managed to tell in 3 minutes or less. What stunned McCartney most profoundly was how effortless Barry made it all seem. He made storytelling look easy and natural. But McCartney understood better. This was craft at the highest level. This was discipline wrapped in swagger and confidence. Barry demonstrated that rock and roll could function as literature, that you could say something genuinely meaningful without losing the infectious rhythm. He proved that intelligence and fun weren't opposing forces, but could work together beautifully. McCartney later reflected that Chuck Berry taught him that every song is essentially a short film, and he carried this lesson into every Beatles track he would ever write. From Paperback Writer to Eleanor Rigby, you can hear Berry's influence in the details, the narrative structure, and the poetry hiding within the groove. Chuck Berry didn't simply play guitar skillfully, he essentially wrote the rule book for rock and roll storytelling, and McCartney memorized every single page. The third foundational album was Elvis Presley's self-titled debut from 1956. Before Elvis burst onto the scene, there were rigid borders separating different types of music. There were divisions between black music and white music, between sacred songs and sinful ones, between the kid you actually were and the rebel you desperately wanted to be. Then this album arrived, and suddenly all those walls came crashing down spectacularly. McCartney was only 13 years old when you first heard this record, and he was never quite the same person afterward. This wasn't just another talented singer. This was a complete revolution wearing blue suede shoes. Elvis took everything, gospel, blues, country, and rock, and melted it all together into something nobody had heard before. His voice moved like liquid, 1 second tender and vulnerable, the next dangerous and thrilling. McCartney simply couldn't believe that one person could contain all that power. Elvis didn't just sing songs, he inhabited them completely. He made you believe every single word, even when the actual words didn't particularly matter. What struck McCartney so deeply was the sense of freedom in Elvis's music. Elvis sounded like someone who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. There was swagger and confidence, absolutely, but underneath all that, there was real vulnerability. A working-class boy from nowhere who somehow sang like he owned the entire world. That particular combination was pure magic. McCartney saw himself reflected in that dynamic, the working-class kid who dreamed much bigger than his circumstances suggested he should. Elvis gave McCartney permission to want more from life, to reach beyond Liverpool's boundaries, to believe that a voice and a dream could genuinely change everything. This album wasn't simply background music for teenagers, it was a detonation. And when the smoke finally cleared, Paul McCartney was standing there, ready and determined to build his own musical empire. The fourth album was The Chirping Crickets by Buddy Holly from 1957. Buddy Holly wore glasses, and somehow that detail mattered enormously. In a world dominated by leather jackets and slicked-back hair, by rebels and bad boys, Holly looked like someone you might sit next to in your math class. He wasn't cool in the traditional sense that Elvis or Little Richard were cool, but he was authentic and real. For McCartney, this changed absolutely everything. The Chirping Crickets proved conclusively that you didn't need to look like Elvis to sound like the future. You just needed great songs, songs that you wrote yourself. Holly's voice had this distinctive hiccup, this catch in it that probably shouldn't have worked musically, but somehow it did work. It made him seem human and relatable rather than distant and godlike. McCartney heard that quality and thought to himself that if Buddy Holly could do this, maybe he could too. Holly wasn't attempting to be someone else or imitate another artist. He was just being Buddy, and somehow that authenticity was more than enough. But here's what really mattered most to McCartney. Holly wrote his own material. He didn't wait patiently for established songwriters to hand him hit songs. He created them himself from nothing. This idea was genuinely revolutionary at the time. McCartney and John Lennon observed this and realized they could do exactly the same thing. They didn't need permission from the music industry establishment. They could be completely self-contained units, writer, singer, and performer all in one person. Holly also demonstrated to McCartney that you could be gentle and soft and still create rock and roll, that melody mattered just as much as attitude and swagger, that sweetness wasn't a weakness to be ashamed of. The chirping crickets wasn't loud or dangerous or rebellious. It was perfect, clean and honest, and in its own quiet way, it changed the entire world. McCartney never forgot the boy with glasses who made it all seem genuinely possible. The fifth influence wasn't actually a single album, but rather an entire movement, the Motown sound. Motown records in the early 1960s became McCartney's university, his higher education in music. Berry Gordy's Detroit Hit Factory taught him something the British music scene simply couldn't, that pop music could have genuine soul, that precision and passion weren't opposing enemies, but could work together beautifully, that a 3-minute single could be simultaneously perfect and real. McCartney studied Motown the way architects study blueprints, with careful attention to every detail. He listened to every bass line, every hand clap, every background vocal stacked like bricks in a solid wall. The Supremes, the Temptings, Marvin Gaye, Smokey Robinson, the Four Tops, these weren't just talented singers, they were skilled craftsmen. Motown songs had clear structure and discipline. They built slowly and carefully, peaked at exactly the right moment, and left you wanting more. McCartney heard this approach and thought to himself that this was how you make something truly timeless.
Nothing in these songs was wasted. Every note had a specific reason for existing. Every harmony had a precise place. But what really grabbed McCartney's attention was the bass playing. James Jameson's bass lines moved like melodies in their own right. They didn't just hold down the rhythm section. They told complete stories. They danced. McCartney picked up his own bass guitar and started experimenting with this approach. He wanted that same fluidity, that swagger, that sense of the bass as a lead instrument rather than just background noise. McCartney later reflected that Motown taught him that pop music could be art without being pretentious or off-putting. Motown never looked down on its audience with contempt. It respected listeners and gave them hooks wrapped in genuine heart. McCartney carried that respect into every Beatles song he ever wrote. The seventh and final album was Bob Dylan's Bringing It All Back Home from 1965. This was the one that really stung, not with jealousy, but with pure admiration. When Dylan released this album in March 1965, he accomplished something the Beatles had been circling around. He made rock and roll genuinely intellectual. He proved that lyrics could function as serious poetry. McCartney, who had always prided himself on clever wordplay, realized that Dylan was playing an entirely different game. This wasn't just music, this was literature with a driving backbeat. Dylan's words tumbled out like riddles wrapped in smoke. They didn't make complete sense on the first listen, or even the second, but they felt profoundly true. McCartney heard this and thought that the Beatles could go deeper than they had been. Dylan wasn't writing simple songs about holding hands. He was writing about identity, freedom, disillusionment, and the weight of simply being alive. And he made it all sound effortless. What made this album revolutionary was its structure. Side 1 was electric and plugged in. Side 2 was acoustic and stripped down. Dylan wasn't choosing between folk and rock. He was taking both, refusing to be boxed into any category. McCartney respected that particular kind of courage. Dylan faced booing crowds for plugging in his guitar at folk festivals, but he did it anyway because the art demanded it. McCartney later said that Dylan showed them that songs could mean something beyond just the melody, and that insight changed everything. After bringing it all back home, the Beatles started writing differently. Albums like Rubber Soul, Revolver, and Sgt. Pepper all carried Dylan's fingerprints. You could hear the search for depth, the refusal to play it safe. Dylan didn't just influence McCartney, he challenged him directly, and McCartney spent the rest of his remarkable career answering that challenge. Paul McCartney never stopped listening and learning. These 7 albums weren't just his personal favorites or casual entertainment. They were his teachers, the solid foundations beneath every song he ever wrote throughout his legendary career. Greatness is never born in isolation. It is always built on the voices and visions that came before, standing on the shoulders of giants. McCartney understood this from the very beginning, and it made all the difference.